it's because of me that we're not right next to the graveside. As a Kohen, I've got to keep my distance, but at the end of this service, we're going to have Tehillim and also Kaddish that will be said by the graveside. So we're here to mark the consecration of Jacob's tombstone, Yaakov Koppel ben Yosef Vepesia. And obviously we want to honor his family, his wife Deirdre, his late sister Pearl, his children and their spouses, Rebecca, Lee, Naomi, Chana, Alei Shalom, John, Lisa, and Alyssa. His grandchildren, Gideon, Oliver Shalom, Nava, Isaac, Raphael, Sarah, Sam, and Simon. And obviously all of his extended family and his friends who are here. Now, there's a difference between a funeral and a consecration. And a funeral is, in a sense, looking backwards. It's looking at the past. It's looking at the man that was. And the matzeva is looking at the man that is. And the word matzeva comes from the word yatsev, to stand, to be firm, to be strong. And we're looking at the eternal and enduring legacy of Rabbi Yaakov Koppel. So we'll start with some Tehillim. I'll share a few words, and then I'll be passing on to Alyssa to also share a few words. So we'll start with Tehillim number 1. We'll say it in English and Hebrew, and then we'll say further Tehillim just in Hebrew. Ashrei ha'ish asher lehalach basas roshoim v'derech hatom le'amad of moshav leitzim le'yashav ki besoros adonai chevtzoi v'serosa yehege yomam v'layla v'hoya ka'etz shosel al palgei moyim asher pirya yitzin b'itzoi v'aleo le'yibol v'chol asher yasi yatzliach le'chein haroshoim kim kamoitz asher tidfenu ruach al kein le'yakum haroshoim v'mishpat v'chatom ba'alas tzadikim ki yadei adonai derech tzadikim v'derech roshoim toved. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of Hashem, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, whose leaves do not wither, whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For Hashem watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Tehillim Tet Zayin. Michtam LaDavid Shamrani El Ki Chasisi V'Chamart LaReinoi Elohim Ata Tevasi Bal Alecha L'Kdoshim Eshabaretz Hema V'Adirei Kol Chivtzei Bam Yibru Atzvosam Achme Haro Bal Asich Niskei Midam Uvalese Shmosam Asfasai Adonai Menas Chelki V'Chosi Ata Tomich Gerali Chavolim naflu li banimim av nachla shafra alai. Avarech es adinei asher altzani afleilis yisruni chiliyosai. Shivisi adinei lenegdi somid ki mimini bal emoitz. Lachein samach libi v'yogol kavodi af besori yishkan lavetach. Ki leisazev nafshi lisho leisisin chasid chalir eshachas. Terieni rechaim svas moches es panecha nima es b'min chanetzach. Tehillim Tzadik Aleph. Yoshev b'sez e'ilya mitzal shadi yisleinan. Amar adinai machziyim matzudasi el hayav tachboi, ki hu yatzilchem mipach yokush medeva havais, be'evrasi yasechlach, v'sachas kenafav techatset tzina v'schera amitzai. Le'sir mipachad loila, u'meichetziof yomam, medeva boifa yahalech, miketev yoshud tzaharayim. Yipal mitzidcha elef, rovavim minecha alecha le'igosh, rak beinecha sabit v'shil masrushoyim tira, ki ata adinai machziyelien samta meinecha. Le'suna lecha ra'a, v'nega le'ikra ba'alecha, Ki malachav yitzavalach lishmarcha b'chal drachecha. Al kapayim yisaunucha pen diga fever naglecha, al shachav afesen tidrech tirmes kfir v'sanin. Ki vichashak v'afaltayu as agveyu ki yadashimi, yikraeni ve'eneyu ima yenechi v'tzara, achaltayu v'yachadehu. Orech yomim asbiyehu v'yareyu b'shuasi. I thought that the right thing to do at this moment is to reflect on the elements of the life of Jacob Goldstein, now AM. He obviously is this year been welcomed as a member of the Order of Australia. And to reflect on those elements that are enduring. And those parts of his character which we can take a message for and which we can turn not into a matzeva, a tombstone that is of stone, but a tombstone that is of flesh. That is something in our heart that we can carry with us as an enduring legacy. And it's not very difficult. when you look at the life of Jacob, you see a life that was lived with enduring and eternal values. He wasn't a man who was superficial or who took interest in just the material. He was a person who always looked up at higher values, at things that were eternal and long-lasting. And a few of those things that I'll mention here. Number one, I want to mention his beautiful marriage to Deirdre, 51 and a half years, which is something that I think requires reflection on, because you don't get to 51 and a half years without a certain degree of selflessness, without being a loving person, a caring person, and someone who is entirely dedicated to another person above and beyond themselves. And that is one tombstone that we can establish in our heart. Another is his courage. He faced, unfortunately, a number of personal tragedies, losses of loved ones in his own life. We mentioned Gidon and Naomi. And also personal illness, particularly towards the end of his life. And all of these he confronted with a courage and a stoicism, which is something that we can learn from and, again, take to our heart. It's impossible to mention Jacob without mentioning his professional life. And the fact that, as we know, he was dubbed the godfather of cardiothoracic surgery, having conducted over 10,000 operations. And it wasn't just a job, it was something which he loved. It was an area that he contributed in a very real way to our world, and something which also was beautifully recognized over this past year with his being invited into the Member of the Order of Australia. He was a mensch. He loved helping people, especially Holocaust survivors, who he operated on with a beautiful bedside manner, including a Yiddish bedside manner. And he was a man who was dedicated to his family, despite being famously the 7 to 11 man who was always working. He never missed a performance of his children. He always assisted his children with their studies and cared deeply for his family and his loved ones. Jacob was a man of no half measures. We mentioned work, which was something that he gave his all to. He was also known for his meticulous medical notes. He holidayed hard as well, never taking a break even on his breaks. At home, again, someone who was dedicated to his family and dedicated to household chores. Even his dishwashing, stacking, as I learnt, he had a particular, very clear method in doing that. And also his physical fitness. Notwithstanding suffering an accident, he got into running after that, starting at age 50 and completing 10 full marathons. And it's very appropriate that today is the day of the Melbourne Marathon. I don't know if that was thought of at the time, but right now we have people running marathons, and no doubt Jacob is smiling down on us with one eye on the runners as they make their way around Beach Road. Of course, another very important legacy of Jacob's is his Yiddishkeit. And despite being a 7 to 11 man, he was really a much before 7 to 11 man, because he was at Getanga, davening Shachris, before his day at work. And also when he was ill, the number one things on his mind was getting well enough so that he could make his way back to shul. And it was something which was, David was just a living authenticity of Yiddishkeit. You looked at him and you saw a Yid. That's all you saw. Just true, true blue, if you can use that phrase in Yiddishkeit. I want to turn to a beautiful confluence outside of the marathon and this consecration. Another confluence is the fact that this is the final parasha of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. And we're going to be reading that on Simchat Torah, Parasha V'Zar HaBracha. And the last 8 verses, the last 8 psukim, get very eerie, because they speak not about Moshe, but they speak about his death. And the commentaries grapple as to how these verses are written. They say, if this talks about Moshe's death, how did he write it? Because it's Moshe's Torah. And there's 2 answers given. One is it was written by his student, Yahshua. And the other answer is that God dictated and Moses wrote in tears. And of course, Jewish scholarship doesn't stop there. It debates, what does it mean in tears? One opinion is that he wrote it while crying. And the other view is he wrote it by dipping his his feather into an inkwell filled with his tears. And it was written with actual tears. But what it tells me is that part of a person's life is what goes beyond their life. A life is not just until a person passes physically from this world, but it's what happens in the thereafter. It's what happens 12 months on. It's what happens 6 months. It's what happens a decade later. And it's very rare to celebrate a kiddush of a person who's not able to be present, but is receiving an Order of Australia medal. And we had that for Jacob at the King's birthday. And that to me reflects something about his life, that his life was a real life, so much so that it didn't end when he passed on. In a sense, one of his greatest achievements occurred after he passed away. Now, as we said at the beginning, the Matseva is not just a stone, it is also flesh. It's also in our heart. And the questions that we need to ask ourselves today are, can we be as dedicated and hardworking and as kindly in our professional life as Jacob was? Can we attain the Menschlichkeit that Jacob did in his humility, in his loving kindness, and in his care for his family? And can we prioritize our Yiddishkeit like he did, despite the busyness of his schedule, despite the fullness of his life, making sure to fit in shul, to fit in his community, to fit Torah and mitzvot into a life that is so filled with all sorts of important endeavors. And on that reflection, it's my honor to call on Alyssa to share a few words about her dad.
Thank you, Rabbi Cowan, for the beautiful words. I'm just going to read aloud the article that I wrote about my dad on the occasion of him receiving the King's Birthday Honours, which I think some of you may have already read, but I think it's a nice accounting of his life, so I felt it was appropriate to read it again today. So this was published on the 9th of June. My father, Jacob Goldstein, did not live to see himself become a member of the Order of Australia this year for his services to cardiothoracic surgery, which is, I think, just how he would have wanted it. Dad worked in hospitals across Melbourne for over 40 years and led the cardiothoracic unit at Monash Medical Centre for 7 years, where he helped train the next generation of heart surgeons. But he was humble about his achievements to the point of obfuscation, eschewing the title of doctor, a misnomer for surgeons in Australia anyway, at least until recently, and sometimes describing himself as a public servant when asked what he did for a living, which was technically true. Although he was genuinely uninterested in accolades for himself, Dad loved reading about who'd gotten a gong, especially when they went to people he knew, which became more frequent in the last decade of his life. Twice a year, he'd pore over the list of names in the Age and the Australian Jewish News, taking equal interest in the big machas and the lifelong volunteers and community workers. What compelled him wasn't the conferring of status, but the stories of the honorees who conjured lives of greatness in Australia seemingly out of nothing, many of them refugees and immigrants like him. However, the very existence of the gong lists, with their hierarchies and abbreviations, always struck me as antiquated. A national honour roll for the worthiest Australians makes sense, but leaking it to the monarchy? In this political economy, not so much. So I had some doubts when my sister started rallying me to work on the nomination forms with her last year. Fortunately, I kept them to myself and put on my editor hat, and gained a deeper appreciation for Dad and his connection to this country in the process. The foundational fact of my father's life is that he was born to 2 Polish Holocaust survivors in a displaced persons camp in Germany in 1947, and came to Australia in 1950 as a stateless child refugee. He often said, with a touch of grim humour, that his parents had one stroke of good fortune in their lives, and that was ending up in Australia. He was right. Working on the draft of Dad's nominations, I read through his speeches delivered at his children's bar and bat mitzvahs, graduations, weddings, and finally at his retirement party in 2022. Several themes recur: his love of Yiddishkeit, his family, Jane Austen, and the pies. But always, underlying it all, was gratitude for the place my grandparents called the Golden Medina, the Golden Land. Dad wasn't a patriot in the cloying, flag-waving sense, but he loved Australia for giving him what every human being deserves: security, stability, a decent public education, meaningful work. He spoke only Yiddish when he started school, but that didn't matter in Melbourne's inner north in the 50s, where thousands of new Australians, as they were quaintly called, had poured in from the bleeding gash of Europe. In Dad's rose-tinted recollection of his youth, he experienced no discrimination or anti-Semitism in Australia, something I somehow both believe and don't. Maybe it was just that he didn't consciously register the microaggressions, which would have been overshadowed by the horrors his parents endured. Or maybe Melbourne in the 50s, 60s and 70s was a simpler place, buoyed by a rush of immigration and post-war prosperity, the demons of history still decades away from catching up with us. Probably a bit of both. Dad did well in school, and thanks to his tenacity and a decent serve of boomer fortune, he graduated in medicine, married my mum, bought a house, took a year off to travel the world, and got into a surgical training program in Melbourne, all by the age of 26, and all without any privilege, money or connections to the overwhelmingly Anglo medical establishment. For 50 years, he worked a punishing on-call schedule that earned him the moniker the 7-Eleven man from Mum, out before 7 a.m, home after 11 p.m. But the reality is that his hours were often much more extreme than that. Such was his dedication to his work and patience. When he was home, though, he was home, tucking us into bed, bemoaning the amount of TV we watched, discussing the footy with my brother, helping us with homework. I have a vivid memory of him leaning over my sister's desk late at night during her VCE years, suit jacket still on and briefcase by his side, expounding on differential equations in a cadence I can only describe as Talmudic. As a surgeon, Dad was known for his compassionate bedside manner in an era when this was not commonplace or even considered important in surgical training. He performed more than 10,000 operations and was well respected and sought out, especially by patients from non-English speaking backgrounds. Dad's empathy was undoubtedly a product of his childhood. From a young age, he and his sister Pearl served as their parents' interpreters. These days, we would describe them as parentified children. And by his own admission, this responsibility cultivated a profound understanding of the experiences of marginalised people. At Monash Medical Centre, he was also committed to training the next generation of heart surgeons, serving as the supervisor of cardiothoracic training from 1989 to 2017. As the beneficiary of an excellent public education from primary school to university, Dad felt compelled to pass his knowledge on to the benefit of Australian and international medical communities, though he wouldn't have phrased it in such idealistic terms. He simply did it. Several of his mentees came from China, Malaysia and India and went on to establish cardiothoracic units in underserved communities back home. One of his former trainees, recounting his guidance through her first major surgical complication, described him as a mensch. She described how Dad patiently educated her throughout the repair, called her that night to check in and see how she was doing, and insisted that she perform that component of the operation herself the next time so that she would have the confidence to master it. My father seemed in so many ways unshakable, which is a quality you want in the person who's going to crack your chest open and hold your heart in their hands. When he was 50, he was in a serious car accident and sustained several broken ribs and was lucky to emerge from our crushed Peugeot station wagon alive. I have never been able to look at the photos of the car, but he appraised them with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a seasoned frontline worker. From his hospital bed, he lamented the injury's impact on his running regimen and wondered if he'd ever crack a PB again. When it was time to leave the hospital, he insisted on driving himself home, torso still black and blue. "You've got to get straight behind the wheel," he explained to 13-year-old me. "You can't let it get to you." 1 year later, he ran a marathon, his first of 11. A person with this level of obstinate drive and apparent invincibility can also be frustrating and uncompromising. I could write a book. But I am grateful for Dad's immense grounding strength, which carried me and countless others through life-altering challenges. On Mother's Day in 2018, my family experienced the greatest challenge of all when my beloved nephew Gideon, Dad's oldest grandchild, was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer at the age of 8. Dad was a rock, attending medical appointments while working full-time and fielding questions from the extended family. That he couldn't save his grandson, who died 11 months later, was the most acute kind of grief. At the beginning of that harrowing, sleepless year, I feared my internal scaffolding would collapse. But instead, I tapped into a reserve of stoicism I didn't know I had, but which had Dad's imprint all over it. He went on to become a star fundraiser for the Robert Connor Dawes Foundation, a wonderful Melbourne-based charity dedicated to paediatric brain cancer research. It wasn't easy for Dad to ask for donations. He liked to keep things low-key, and social media was anathema to him. And he never quite mastered the mass BCC text. But he inevitably wiped the floor with the rest of the family in our annual campaigns, personally raising over $50,000. When Dad's health started to deteriorate rapidly last year, we decided to show him the nomination forms, not knowing if he would live to receive the honour. My sister perched on his bed at Cabrini, another hospital he worked at for decades, and read aloud to him. "This is your life, palliative care spin-off," I thought that day, looking out across the rooftops of Malvern and Caulfield towards my childhood home in Elsternwick. The irony of Dad receiving palliative care in the Catholic hospital that he and so many other Jewish doctors helped shape, so close to the bagel belt of Melbourne, felt like a fitting coda. He listened with a look of amazement, both at the effort we had gone to and the testimonials from his peers and former trainees, occasionally lifting his eyebrows and shaking his head in his characteristic expression of self-effacement, almost as if he were listening to another person's biography. He died at home a few months later. Now, inevitably, I find myself perusing the list of honorary names as Dad once did. He would have been a little embarrassed by all the fuss, but I can quell. The AM is a fitting tribute from the place that made him, a place that is in turn enriched by the people it opens its doors to, child refugees and skilled immigrants alike. You never know who's going to walk off a boat or a plane and hold your hand in their heart one day. I just wish I could pick up the phone and share the news the way he used to. Guess who got a gong?
Thank you, Alyssa, for those beautiful words and reflections. I'm now going to read the Matseva, and obviously you'll shortly be able to read it yourself when we're beside it. So these are the words that are on it. Pei Nun, which stands for Ponitman, here is interred. Yaakov Koppel, Ben Yosef Vepesia. Niftar Tet Cheshvan, Tovshin Pei Daled. So that's the Hebrew date that he passed, the 9th of Cheshvan, 5784. Taf Nun Sadik Beit Hay, which stands for Tehei Nishmatot Tzurah B'Tzurah Chaim. May his soul be bound up in the eternal binding of life. And underneath that it says in English, in loving memory of Jacob Goldstein AM, 27th of the 9th, 1947 to 24th of the 10th, 2023. Son of Yossel, Oliver Shalom, and Pola, Aleha Hashalom, husband of Deirdre, father of Joshua, Naomi, Aleha Hashalom, Rebecca and Alyssa, father-in-law of Lee and Lisa, older brother of Pearl, Aleha Hashalom, and brother of Mendel, Hashem Yim Kandama, and Tovia, Hashem Yim Kandama, Zayda of Gidon, Oliver Shalom, Nava, Isaac, and Raphael, Sarah, Sam, and Simon. And underneath it, it has two lines saying, a master surgeon and outstanding mentor, admired and respected by all who knew him. We'll now say the memorial prayer. El Malay Rachamim, Shoyechein Bamira Yemim,
Hamitzei menucha nechayena ala kanefei hashchina b'mahalois kedoyeshim otzehayerim kezoya harakia mazhirim esenishmas Yaakov Koppel ben Yosef Pesia shehalach li'olamai ba'avur shitein tzedakah b'araskaras nishmasai b'ganei eden etzei menuchasai lochein balarachamim yastireo b'seisech enafav li'olamim V'yitzror b'yitzror hachayim es nishmasai Adoyenayehu nachalasai V'yanuach b'sholdoim al mishkavai v'noy maramein.
At this point, I want to wish the family long life, and may Jacob remain forever in your hearts and in all of our hearts as an enduring legacy. I'm going to now hand over to the family who are going to head to the tombstone for Kaddish. Josh is going to say some Tehillim when he gets there, and then there'll be an opportunity to say Kaddish at the tombstone itself. So everyone's invited to follow to row N.